13 Network, and you are listening to Surrounded by Idiots.
In your face, all over the place. We're online 24/7. 24/7. You're listening to the hottest internet station.
From beautiful Saline in southeastern Michigan.
Around the world at sunskyMysteries.com.
This is the 2009 Top 10 Webcam in the World winner. This is SETV.
Now, as part of this partial shutdown, there has been a major event that happened in Washington, D.C. that I want to talk about because it thrills me to no end and it also upsets me to no end. And those of you on the video side of the show at USSAMichigan.com are seeing the story that I'm going to be talking about. This comes to us from Fox News. The greatest generation veterans sweep past barricades at memorial in their honor. And as I read this, if you have not read this or if you've not heard this, you are both going to be very, very pissed off and very, very happy at the same time. What was meant to be a final gathering of heroes Tuesday instead became a final victory for dozens of World War II combat veterans who refused to let a government budget battle block a visit to their memorial in the nation's capital. With bagpipers playing Amazing Grace, nearly 200 veterans from Mississippi and Iowa swept past barricades and security guards at the World War II Memorial in Washington in order to keep a commitment to visit the site, which was closed today due to the partial government shutdown. The veterans, in their 80s and 90s, were accompanied by Representative Stephen Palazzo, Republican of Mississippi, a former Marine who earlier vowed not to let the National Park Police keep them from a planned visit to the open-air monument. Some veterans on hand wiped away tears when they saw a crowd waving the American flag. These men and women didn't cower to the Japanese and the Germans, Palazzo said. I don't think they're about to let a few National Park Police stand in their way. Palazzo, who was joined by several other members of Congress, moved the barricades at the memorial, and the police did not try to stop the veterans' access. Congressman Bill Xam of Michigan told GulfLive.com, quote, "This is the best civil disobedience we've seen in Washington in a while." And that's tonight's commentary. And now a brief commercial message, and we will be getting back to the show with our guest. Tonight's sponsor is SmallCompanyMovingGuide.com, a very clever resource. It is a resource for small businesses. Now, what do the Queen of England, the Mensa organization, a lumber yard in Washington State, and a radio station in Oregon have in common? Well, what they have in common is that they have all purchased the Small Company Moving Guide. The Small Company Moving Guide is a workbook-style resource that will guide your small business from point A to point B to point C through the moving process. When you need to move your business, whether you're upsizing or downsizing. This thing is great. It has sample floor plans. It tells you what to do 3 months before the move, 2 months before the move, a month before the move, during the day of the move. You know, if you're moving a small business and you're in a city, one of the things that you could potentially forget is whether or not the freight elevator in the building you're moving into is open on the day that you want to move in. Say you want to move your company on a Sunday. Well, if that freight elevator isn't open, you get to that new building of yours, guess what? You're not moving in. You got to wait until Monday when they open it up. Small Company Moving Guide will give you tips like that. And as we always say, if it's good enough for the Queen of England, Moving Guide for you. Small. And there we go. That is our advertiser for the night, smallcompanymovingguide.com. And now I'm going to bring in our guest. He is an author. He has written a couple of books, Rendering Unto Caesar, The Fairest Tax, and Shortening the Leash on Politicians. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to announce Mr. Bob Savage, coming directly to us from Georgia. Bob, how are you doing this evening?
Bill, I'm doing fine. I hope you are. And I've really been looking forward to this opportunity to talk with you tonight.
Well, that is excellent. I am most happy to have you on the show. What did you think of my opening commentary?
Well, I was cheering. I happened to be at an American Legion meeting last night, and we talked about the similar event the day before, and then it happened again today. And that just thrills me. The sight of those barricades around the national monuments, so unnecessary, so unlike what this country stands for.
Yeah, they want to talk about mean-spirited. That's mean-spirited right there, folks. You'd look no farther than that. As a matter of fact, I think you, the American Legion, and everybody that worked to get those veterans in there deserves a huge round of applause. And there you go. That is for all the veterans, including you, Bob. I understand that you, in fact, are a veteran, and you actually have a connection to the World War II Memorial.
Well, that one in particular, does excite me a whole lot. I got to see it a couple of years ago for the first time. But many, many years ago, I was in the Navy, and I did not get to go to sea very much. I had an office instead in Washington where I did some engineering work. And that office, it turned out, was probably within 100 feet of that memorial. In those days, we had buildings on the mall, and my particular office was in a little two-story barracks-type temporary building that had been put there in World War I. And I could sit in my office and look out on the reflecting pond. So I was within 100 feet of where that memorial is right now. The offices are gone. The mall is cleaned up. There's a little lake there, I think, now. But it was very special to me.
Well, that's good. On behalf of the entire audience, thank you for your service to the country. I truly, truly appreciate it.
Well, thank you for saying so.
Yeah, you're welcome. So let's get on with the topics for the evening. The first thing I want to talk about is something that's been in the news a lot, and that is the IRS hoopla with the 501Cs. And I understand, let me see here if I can bring this up on the screen for the folks to see. You have a 501C, a Firm 1776, where you it says you further your ideas to rekindle the miracle of 1776. And I'm wondering, given the topic of your 501c, did you get any difficulties in getting your 501c approved?
I did go back to see who signed our approval letter, and it was not Lois Lerner. My approval letter came through in 2007, right after we had filed. It didn't take too long. And either she was not on the job at that time, or the issue had not been focused quite the way they focused it a few years later.
Okay.
So I'm proud to say ours was approved rather quickly, and it still is there. And one of the things I am trying to do is make that website become a whole lot less static and get it going to where it's something people can interact with a lot more than it allows right now. It's got a blog. It also has a speakers bureau on it where we offer to do town halls, we offer to do presentations, and that sort of thing, as long as they're within the subject range of its purposes.
Very good.
It has three purposes.
Okay.
But the first one is the one we're trying to concentrate on the most. I believe that the Founding Fathers thought very thoroughly and very hard and very reasonably. They didn't produce a perfect product, but the way they thought and the way they acted and the things they intended are things we need to get back to in this country today. And that's the first purpose of a firm. If we can do that through town halls, if we can do that through presentations, if we can do that through books such as the one I've written, and a lot of other people have got some really good books out there as well, we could get this nation cranked up and going again.
Yes, I pray to God every single night, sir, that happens. The website address is affirm1776.org, AFFIRM1776.org. Go there and you can read about all about Bob's books and other information. And when we were talking the other day about doing the show, I thought up, and actually you thought it up first, about using your PowerPoint presentations for the show, so that essentially it would be like a town hall meeting tonight here on the show. In fact, if anybody wants to call the show, the studio line is area code 347-677-0812, 347-677-0812. And if we see anybody calling in, we will try to get you on the air. But let's go to the first slideshow. Let me get that up there. There we go. Shortening Our Leash on Politicians. This is your latest book, isn't it?
Yes, this is the one that just came out. Just got released the middle of last month.
Okay.
By the publisher.
Okay, and who's the publishing house that put it out?
Well, it's a very good firm out in Oklahoma City called Tate Publishing. They're a small firm. They're not one of the big publishing houses, but they do an awful lot of good work. And I felt very fortunate a few years ago when they accepted one of my first manuscript, and then we've gone from there.
Excellent.
To the second one.
Now, I know the new book is available on Amazon in paperback form, but if you go to the Tate Publishing website, you can also download the ebook, which is what I did. I purchased and downloaded the ebook the middle of last week, so it is available for reading. You can get it in a PDF format or in a ebook format, and it is quite a read. But I have the first slide here up on the screen. It is the title, Shortening Our Leash and Politicians, and I'm going to go on to the next slide. And that's the one that is titled Chart 2. So I'm going to let you go ahead and take it away, Bob, and explain
okay.
how the hell we're going to shorten up our leash on these clowns in Washington, D.C.
Well, let me talk just a minute about some assumptions I've made here, because I think that's what leads me to the conclusion that we can do it if we work at it hard enough. Number one, our founders were statesmen. It is unbelievable to me to consider how many differences of opinion must have existed between, say, John Adams and of Massachusetts and Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, or even Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. And yet, because they knew they had a major thing to accomplish, and they probably had a short window to do it in, they managed somehow to overcome those differences. Now, because of those differences, they didn't solve every problem with the initial Constitution that they put out, but they were indeed statesmen. And they believed, I think, or maybe if they didn't believe it, they certainly hoped it, that this representative government they set up would be run by people who followed them who would also be statesmen. They knew that government officials had to act in balanced ways. There would be times when an official would go to in the federal government that they created would have to go up there and meet and strongly represent his district or his state or whatever. There would be other times when he might have to somehow sacrifice some of the interest of his or her state, well, his in those days, but ultimately I think they knew it would be his or hers, when they would have to sacrifice some of the best interest of their particular state or their particular district for the overall good. So they were statesmen, and I think they believed, or at least hoped, that these representatives that followed them would be so. You see, they built what was called a representative republic. They were doing their best to take all of the best traits of a democracy without actually creating a democracy, because if you look at democracies throughout the history of the world, they ultimately collapse in on themselves. So they were looking for the very best traits they could find of a democracy without picking up the fatal flaws, and that was a representative government. Secondly, they represented their individual states. They weren't trying, I don't believe, to create a government that would lord it over or enslave, if you want, the states. They thought their individual states were taking care of most of the items of business. Connecticut would not treat capital crime the same way that, say, North Carolina would. Rhode Island would have a business code that was similar but not identical to, say, Virginia. But each of the states were doing all those things, and they thought that that was fine. The one thing they didn't have was a place where they could collect all of their resources for a most important situation, and that was national defense. If France had decided to come at us, if Spain had decided to come at us in those years, if the Indians that weren't the friendly ones decided to make a lot of trouble, we needed to pool our resources for a national defense, and that's what they created. They created a 14th government to work with, I believe, the 13 states, which they thought were doing everything else pretty well. Because they did things differently, because the people in South Carolina didn't look upon every, say, public education the same way that, say, the people in Maryland might, and that sort of thing. They both took care of public education in ways that satisfied their local citizens, but they didn't necessarily do it the same way. And these founders weren't looking to create a big government that would suddenly make everybody do it the same way. From that point, then, they let's see. Let me move it along just a little bit. If you could move that slide up just another notch.
Yep, we're at slide 3 now. And just one quick interruption here. If I recall correctly, and I've been hearing this constantly from another radio host, one of the first coins that was minted here in the States, the motto on it was "Mind Your Business," which I believe speaks absolutely directly, Bob, to what you're talking about right there. About the small government. Mind your business.
If you read the Federalist or the Federalist Papers, the overwhelming, overarching concept that was, to me, goes through all of them, was that this federal government was not put there to make all the states fall into line with one system or one way of doing things. It was put there so they would have a place to all pool their resources in the event they needed to defend the nation. Because let's face it, if the national defense fell, then there was no point in having a state or a city or a county or anything like that, because once France took over or Spain took over or the Indians took over, it would all be gone. So they had to pay attention to national defense. And they knew that a national defense would be best taken care of if it was handled by one entity, one government. And that was the primary thing that they set up this new federal government to do. They really thought that the other states, that the 13 states were doing a good job in other things and would continue to take care of business in their own ways after this federal government was set up. That leads to the third thing. They really thought this federal government would stay small. Hamilton, I believe, made a lot of arguments in the Federalist Papers about there was no way this federal government would ever grow very large because, for one thing, just the sheer number of employees in the states would so overwhelm the few employees in the federal government that the federal government would, in effect, basically cow down most of the time to the states. That's changed a little bit, but they really believed it. Now, they did do some other things because there were a few jobs that a single entity could do better than 13 entities trying to work it out themselves. For example, a single entity was the best one to issue coins and dollar bills, and a single entity was the best one to build a post office and the post roads and that sort of thing. A single entity, they actually needed one court to be the ultimate judge of all courts, whether they be state or federal courts. And as lawsuits and cases came up through these courts over the years, there had to be one ultimate judge. And so they put the Supreme Court in the one entity for that reason. They might well have left the Supreme Court to the 13 states, but they didn't. But there were a lot of common things. They needed one party to deal with the international relations. They didn't want New York dealing with France and making a deal that would somehow later work bad things on Virginia. They needed to make sure that South Carolina didn't somehow cut a deal with the Dutch on loans, and so that would later work to the disadvantage of Massachusetts. So they wanted one party to do international dealings. They ended up assigning a few other things to the federal government, but they really and truly thought that the federal government would stay, I think, very small and would only become dominant in a issue such as a war. Otherwise, the states would carry the loads. The states would have the business laws and the business codes. The states would have the criminal and the civil laws. The states would do the education systems. in ways that the people in those states thought best. And if New Hampshire thought it was best to run the schools one way, and North Carolina thought it best to run the schools another way, they both ran schools, and they both took care of education, but in ways that local folks felt better about. That was really where they were coming from. Now, to go on with your question now, we have, from that point, we have just taken it to a whole new level in what we have done with the federal government. We have allowed, particularly in the last 60 to 75 years, the federal government to become just a dominant entity that is driving the states rather than the other way around. And I believe the premise of this book is that somehow we've got to get back to the point where these representatives that we send to Washington, and to a certain extent it might also apply to the state capitals, but largely let's talk about Washington. We've got to get back to the point where the people we send up there truly represent us. I don't think they do today. They go up there and they get, even if we send the best guy in the world or the finest lady in the world in terms of ethics and morality and everything else, when they get to Washington, it is unbelievable what they run into. First of all is the self-esteem that gets so built up because they're just the center of everything. But they're also the focus of, we have talked a lot in the last few years about the lobbies, the high-paid lobbies and the businesses and the chambers and the unions and the Sierra clubs that give them so much money and so many perks that they have to feel bound to listen to those people and maybe eventually do their bidding. I think in the last few months or the last few years, we've seen that there's another force that may even be more, pardon my French, but sinister than even the lobbyists. And that is these entrenched these entrenched bureaucrats who get in these jobs and year after year, particularly if they're higher up in management or something like that, year after year they bend the rules, they bend the drive, they bend the focus of agencies, of branches, of departments, of bureaus, and we're seeing some of it now. The IRS thing to me is a good example. The Department of Justice focusing on a couple of, more than a couple, of reporters and things like that. These are coming largely from bureaucrats, not necessarily from lobbyists. But finally, it's just the pure power that the individual is given and the adoration that they're granted on every side, that even if we send up the best guy or the finest lady in the world, I'm not sure any of us could really hold out very long under those kinds of conditions. So how do we change some of that? Well, I began to think some about it, and that's where the book came from, Shortening Our Leash on Politicians. It seems to me there's several ways we could do it. Basically, we've got to start taking away from them just virtually unlimited largesse to do anything they want to do. And if we don't believe that, take a look today at what they're foisting on us in terms of, say, Obamacare. And yet, as much as they want to tell us how good Obamacare is going to be, they don't want to be part of it. So they exempt themselves and some of their very finest and biggest and most generous friends, unions or big businesses or what have you. So we need to begin to start taking away and putting limits on some of the powers that they have. You mentioned at the start of your broadcast the requirement for a budget, and yet the Senate has seen no need and has literally blocked any effort to create a budget, let alone follow it, in how many years now?
I think it's
I
6.
mean, that is just...
I think it's 6 years.
I'm sorry?
I said, I believe that's 6 years. That gets me so aggravated that each side is blaming the other side when they're both at fault. You know what? We wouldn't have had to have a continuing resolution if the president had offered a damn budget in the first place. That's what gets me. And it's just, we're fed up with all of these people.
Well, take another example. The Affordable Care Act, like it or not, is law. But the president decides, well, I'm going to change a part of that law, and I'm not going to go ask anybody. I'm just going to tell the nation that I'm going to change parts of that law. But I'm not going to change all parts of that law. I'm going to continue to drive it home on the parts that I feel I don't have to change or don't want to change or whatever. What gives the president, as powerful as he is and as much latitude as we need to give him to do his job, what gives him the power or the authority to arbitrarily take on a part of the law and push it off a year or even undo it? To me, he's undoing it when you look at these reimbursements that the Congress and the staffers are going to get in order to make up for the difficulty that the law is going to put on them. By the way, I understand that also we don't hear much about it on the news, but that same largesse and generosity that you and I don't get is also going to happen to the White House staff and other people like that.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
How do we go about crimping their style without doing it to such a fashion that they can't do their job, which is represent us? And I think there are several ways we can do that, several categories we can do that. Number one, we can start insisting that when they pass a law, that certain rules can't be violated or certain rules will apply. How many laws do we have on the book? And let's just take one example. The first one in my book is every law, every regulation, every executive order needs to have an automatic sunset. Today, we've got laws on the books that were written in the 1800s. We've got laws that were probably written in the 1700s. We've got laws that long ago the branch or the bureau that it created did its job or didn't do its job, either way, but is no longer apropos to today's world. WPA or something like that. I think that law actually was removed, but just we've got organizations throughout the government that have long ago satisfied their original thing, and yet when we go to shut down a Navy base or an Army base or an Air Force base, for example, all of a sudden all of the local folks say, "Oh, you can't do that. That'll hurt our economy." So we leave them in place. And we did finally find some ways to shut a few of those off. But that's just an example of the kinds of things that we've got throughout the government, whether it be in the Department of Interior, whether it be in the Department of Energy, whether it be in Health and Human Services, whether it be in education or what have you. So one of the limits we could put on them that, in my mind, does not take away the power to do what they need to do, but does give us a little more control in this regard, is we can insist that every law have an automatic sunset. That is, that at the end of 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever, it and everything that's been added to it or modified along the way will go away unless the senators and the congressmen, the representatives 6 years later think that it is a good law and ought to be renewed, in which case they can renew it. Otherwise, they can just let it die. They can renew it with improvements or what have you. Now, not everything would have the same term. Some things would automatically sunset fairly quickly, say 1 year or 2 years. 2 years, for example, might be something like the passage that we talked so much about not too long ago about extending unemployment compensation. 6 years. How about agricultural subsidies? If they're good, they can be renewed. But if they're just continuing something that got started years ago and no longer really serve the kind of purpose they should, why don't they automatically sunset? What about the tax code? Why should a tax code go on forever? Why can't we every 10 years force them to relook at the tax code and consider whether it ought to be renewed, it ought to be modified, or it ought to be dropped and let something else take its place? Things of that nature. Another example in the field of putting limits on the things they can enact. How about saying to the Congress, no more of this monkey business of putting a museum for your state's university in a bill that's entitled the Federal Highway Act of 2013. What does a museum have to do with the Federal Highway Act? Well, I'll tell you what it had to do in most cases. In most cases, Senator so-and-so simply said to the sponsor of the Highway Act bill, I'll vote for your bill if you'll put my museum in there and I can go home and take some credit for it. Or how about, I won't vote for your bill unless you put that museum in there. Or unless in another state you put in a new hospital for the city of so-and-so and that sort of thing. One of the things that I think the founders were amazing at is their ability to compromise. They compromised truly in many, many ways, I think. Today, we hear politicians talk about compromise, but to me, what they're talking about is horse trading. They're not talking about compromise. Or if, like the current situation with the shutdown, one side thinks it's got all the marbles and it doesn't need to negotiate in any way whatsoever, regardless of what the polls show about how the public feels about the marbles they've got. They just don't do it. They just do power plays, brinksmanship, and that sort of thing. So we could, I think, put in a rule that says from now on, whatever's in that bill better very neatly relate to the title of that bill. And in fact, let's go a little bit further. Let's put together a panel of experts on highways, which would be engineers, business people around the country who could vote randomly on that bill and have that panel of experts review the bill, and before it actually goes in, if they manage to sneak something in anyway, strip it out. Strip it out. Now, we've talked for years about giving presidents line item vetoes, and they don't want to do that, and I'm not sure it would work very well anyway, because if one party was in power when it went in effect, then you can be sure that when the other party gets in power later on, they will use it as a hammer on the first party. So line item vetoes by a president may not work, but if we had real experts who independently reviewed that bill within, say, 10 days after it was passed or something like that, and they could strip out the museum that has nothing to do with a highway, then that might be a way we could do something like that. Another way we can...
I have a question for you. I have a question for you about it. The panels. Who do you envision would be selecting these panels?
Well, I talk about the panels in the first book, so we may get to it a little later on, but let me just give you an example. The first book's all about taxes. So let's say we needed a panel to make some economic decisions relating to the tax codes. Well, who are the experts in this country? Now the politicians were up in Congress, and they voted, and they came up with whatever they came up with, and that sort of thing. And they included a lot of political angles to the thing. But the technical experts are probably all the CPAs in the American Association of Certified Professional Accountants who have passed tests and really have some real expertise in accounting. They probably are the economists, the professional economists that around the country, all over the country, who belong to the American Economics Association and have passed tests that say they're really an accomplished economist. There will be some business managers all around in companies all around the country who belong to the American Management Association, and they have passed tests and been certified as really professional managers. What we could do in a case where we had let's say we had need of an economic panel of experts, we could go to those organizations and we could say, okay, here's the bill, put this in front of all of your people, and in 10 days we're going to let them vote electronically on the internet or however. We probably have to have a little security, I guess, but we're going to let them all vote their opinion of this bill. And then just like any good poll, we're going to let the computer a little later on select a random sample of all those votes, hundreds of thousands, 10,000 or whatever, that came in on that particular bill, and maybe we want to weight it 1/3 toward the accountants and 1/3 toward the economists and 1/3 toward the business managers and that sort of thing. And depending upon the results from that, we would either strip some of the articles out of that bill or let it go as is, or even some other action. But what we would be doing now is having technical judgments applied to the how much sense or how much reason is there in this bill that was generated by politicians and voted on by politicians. Now, if we needed a panel of experts in terms of highways, then it would probably be businesses that build highways and their associations. It would probably be accountants again, and we could put together very easily for all kinds of different situations an appropriate panel, and we could have that process work very nicely in lots of cases. That's not very unlike what we did a few years ago when it was the only way we could decide which of the many military bases were going to get closed and which ones were going to remain standing. We put together experts, and then basically we did it a little backwards from what I'm saying, because the experts came in with this plan and Congress had to vote up or down, couldn't make changes and that sort of thing. And that's how we got some of our bases that were no longer necessary closed. But a panel of experts could put an expert judgment on top of, overlay on top of a political judgment, and then bills go forward or not from that point. Another area that we often run into is bills that have what I call micro provisions in them. We might get a 30-page bill that is very difficult to read, but the people who know it best will read down and they'll realize that, you know what, here's an appropriations bill for a defense contract, and there's really only one company that can do that in all the world. And so the bill sounds wonderful, but it turns out that there's really only one company. We need to be very careful and limit. We probably cannot do away with micro provisions, because there are many times when a particular appropriation for, say, the Defense Department, there just aren't but a handful of companies that have the capacity and the resources and the manpower and the money to put together a brand new kind of fighter jet or something of that nature. But we can limit even things with micro provisions in them. Those are things we can do to the laws and the bills and the regulatory issues that they put out. There are also some things we can do to them without hurting their bodies, per se. And, of course, the most common one today that we talk about a lot is term limits. But in my book, I talk about term limits with a twist. Basically, what I think we need, what a number of states have put in term limits in various shapes and sizes, and if you read a good bit about them, most of the outcomes are pretty reasonable. They're not perfect, but they're pretty reasonable. But I think that there is something, and I cover it in my book, Shortening Our Leash, about term limits that none of them, to my knowledge, have addressed just yet. And that is that if we do term limits, we need to do them in such a way that they have a little bite to them if necessary. One of the reasons ordinary people don't make a run for Congress is they can't afford it. So we need to put some limits on just how they. We need to make it easier for more people to run. We need more than just lawyers in Congress. I think it would be beautiful if we had a much bigger mix of, say, doctors, educators, military people, business managers, teachers. If we had more of those kind of people in Congress instead of just either lawyers or people who've just decided they're going to make a career out of politics no matter what. If we could find ways to get more of them to join and make a run, first of all, serve your country. Give us 4 years out of your career, if you will, but we will try our best to make it good to you. If you own a small business and you're the key employee and you want to give up 4 years to go run for Congress, we need to give you the resources not only to go to Washington and serve in Congress and make a pretty good salary, but we need to help you take care of your business so that you can come back to it at the end of your term. If we need to subsidize your business just a little bit during that time so that you can hire an employee to replace you during that term, and because, many small businesses don't have those kind of resources, then that's one way we could help you. We can also put some bite in it in another way. At the end of your term, when you decide to go back to your business, or you decide to start a whole brand new career, or you just decide to go out and retire and live the rest of your life on the beach, no matter what, we need to make sure that you are adequately compensated through a pension at the end of that term. But we don't need that pension to be just an open-ended, everybody gets so much gravy, man, it's just wonderful. We need to actually have a panel of experts review your record during that time and judge you on just how well you did several things. How well did you represent your constituency? If you were a representative from the 10th district of the state of so-and-so, did you sometimes, when it made sense, give up a little bit on your constituency and vote for something that was good for the whole country? How often did you go back to your district and meet with your constituents instead of staying up in Washington or taking a trip to India to review, I don't know how they do screening on Madra prints or something like that, and you did it because a Chamber of Commerce lobbyist paid your bill, and you got a nice vacation out of the deal.
Yeah.
How often did you do those kinds of things? And let me tell you, if you don't get a pretty good score, then you won't get a pretty good pension. So it ought to have some bite to it, and that sort of thing. And again, we'd use the experts the panel of experts kind of thing. One of the beauties to me, Bill, of a panel of experts, if we've got CPAs and economists and business managers, and we've got 10,000 of them, and they're scattered all over this nation, they're some of them are in Seattle, some of them are in San Francisco, L.A., Phoenix, Miami, Atlanta, Houston, New York, Boston, Chicago, whatever, and I'm a lobbyist. How do I get to those people and influence them? Which ones do I get to? Because after all 10,000 of them may vote, but the computer's only going to pick a small sample, and nobody knows who that is. How do I exercise my power as a lobbyist, and how do I exercise my power as a entrenched bureaucrat at that point in time? And then if we give a grade to somebody who did a poor job, then that grade would be reflected in just what kind of pension they get afterwards, that sort of thing. On the other hand, if we get a good grade to somebody, then a small business person has got the choice to either go back and resume his small business. Maybe he wanted to make a career change, so he decides instead of that, I'm gonna hire and pay on my own for that fellow that replaced me during this time, and I'm going to go back to school and learn a whole different career and start out another place. Or I'm just going to go down to Miami and lounge on the beach the rest of my life, something like that. So term limits are a way that we could do. And by the way, term limits ought not apply just to congressmen. They ought to apply to the executives. And I frankly think they especially ought to apply to judges. I see no good thing coming from any judge sitting in a job more than 6 years. I might be willing to say the Supreme Court justice will give him or her, say, 12 years. But why should a judge ever be allowed to sit for just the rest of their life? I know the founders wanted them to be independent. I know they wanted them to be free thinkers. But 6 years or 12 years is plenty of time, and we've got lots of good people to replace them and continue the good thinking or whatever, that sort of thing.
I have a question about that, especially with the judges.
Okay.
If we limit the terms of the judges, number one, who would select the replacements? 'Cause that's traditionally been the executive branch. And number two, wouldn't that lend itself to more activist judges that are being picked by one party or the other? One party gets in and they have judges that rule one way and then they rule the other way, and it just it almost seems to me like it would be a self-defeating operation. Or am I completely wrong on that?
Well, I don't know that you're completely wrong, but I think we would gain the advantage that it would not be. But just to be safe, in the book, I also said that judges should be subject to reviews every couple of years.
Okay.
By either the citizens or by experts, just as the president should be subject to a review either by Congress every couple of years or by, if enough citizens file a petition, then a president ought to be subject to a review there. I also put another class of officials subject to review. In Congress, you and I think, ought to be able to review our congressmen and, if necessary, raise a petition or something for a vote of confidence every couple of years. I should not be allowed, though, to sign a petition for your Congress against your congressman, and you should not be allowed to sign one against mine, unless your congressman or my congressman happens to be part of what Congress calls leadership. The Senate Majority Leader, and several of the Minority Leader, and several of the other senators are elected by their fellow senators to be what's called leaders. And if we get a Senate leader who leads in a way that is hurtful to the nation in the eyes of all of us as citizens, we ought to be able to raise a petition and tell the Senate, you get that guy or that lady out of that job and put somebody else in there. You can choose who else you put in there, but you get them out of there.
It's kind of a parliamentary type of thing, isn't it?
Pardon?
It's sort of a parliamentary type of operation, sort of like what they have in Great Britain, isn't it?
Well, it is, and the founders very, very specifically, I think, said that the Senate and the House would create their own rules. So they have their own Robert's Rules of Orders, except they have their versions of it and that sort of thing, and they should follow it. But even if they follow those rules of order, their rules that they have created, and we the people think in enough numbers that they are hurting the country, then I think we ought to be able to step in and make a case about it. We've mentioned the budget thing earlier, and that just tears into me that the sheer arrogance of the Senate and the House and the President to think that just because we elected them, that they're able to now do whatever, regardless of what they promised when they were running for election, they're now able to operate in whatever manner and mode they choose to operate. That just doesn't seem to be something that we ought to be without a voice on right now.
It sticks in your craw,
and
doesn't
I'm sure
it?
there are a lot of other issues just like that too.
Yeah, it just sticks in your craw.
Yeah, that is tough order. By the way, we haven't gotten to my other book, but in my tax plan, one of the advantages of my tax plan is by constitutional amendment, they would have to set a budget. And they would have to set a budget by September 1 of the preceding year. And if they don't, the budget would be set automatically for them at 95% of last year's budget.
Like our the sequester.
That's another one.
like
down the
like
road
the sequester that we're currently operating under, which I personally think is a fabulous idea.
I'm sorry?
Which I personally think is a fabulous idea.
Well, yeah, and it's beginning to have some pretty good effects. Now, it was done in a way that I know when I spent 28 years in a large firm, my personal experience was when top management put out an edict that we were going to cut our budgets, but instead of cutting selectively where an organization was not as effective and leaving a very effective department untouched, we just cut across the board. That's what sequester has done.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really a chicken way out on the part of people who can't come to an agreement on themselves. There would have been plenty of ways, some of which you and I would have agreed with, some of which you and I might not have agreed with, but there would have been plenty of ways to cut the dollars that sequester cuts without just literally beginning a process of bringing our Defense Department to its knees. And look what that's doing to our country internationally as we bring our Defense Department to its knees.
Yeah.
There would have been plenty of places to cut and still got the dollars, still cut the dollars that the sequester cuts. Overall, cutting the dollars, I think, has helped because the deficits are down. They're still deficits, by the way, but they are down, even though a lot of forecasters I read think that it's only a matter of a couple of years till they start climbing again. But there are some good effects, in my mind, from what we have done. It's just that the way we've done it is sort of a chicken way of doing it, and it means that some groups that shouldn't have been cut as severely did get cut severely, and other groups that probably should have been eliminated are still there, still operating, still doing their video spoofs or management study cases or whatever they do with those things these days.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. I'm going to let you make an executive decision here. We've got about 45 minutes left in the show. When do you want to switch over to talking about your tax plan?
Well, I think we can do it pretty quick. I can mention a couple of other things very quickly.
Okay, you go ahead. You just tell me when you want to switch over, because I want to make sure we hit them both.
There are some other ways we can limit the power of our officials. The Constitution talks about impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors. We know pretty much what high crimes are. They're treason and that sort of thing. But there's an awful lot of things that go on today that, by all rights, we ought to put them in the category and strictly define them, to me, as high crimes. To me, it is a high crime for a federal bureaucrat to run something like, let's say, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and then to stand up and say, I don't agree with the law, so we're going to pull ICE agents off the border. And we're not going to push prosecutions and things like that. We would not stand for a moment for a military commander who had a unit to defend, let's say, Houston from an attack coming out out of the Gulf from Venezuela or somebody like that. Even if that commander didn't have enough troops, didn't have enough rockets, didn't have enough missiles to do the job, we would still expect him to stand up there and do everything in his power to defend Houston. We would not accept that because he didn't agree that Houston needed to be defended was a good thing. We won't even stand for our favorite team quarterback not to at least throw a Hail Mary at the end of the game if there's some chance it might pull the game out for us and that sort of thing. How in the world can we sit here and accept a bureaucrat saying, I won't do such and such, even though I took an oath to follow the law of the land, but I won't do it because I don't agree with it, you didn't give me enough money, I don't have enough people, what have you. We just would not agree with that sort of thing in other situations. I think we ought to expand our definition of high crimes and misdemeanors and run some of those people off real quick. We ought to have some way to limit lame duck excuses. If a president gives a pardon in the 11th hour just before he goes out of office or she goes out of office, and we know deep down that is a illegitimate pardon, Congress ought to have 2 weeks to undo that, the new Congress that's coming in. Same thing if the old Congress just passed a law. I guess the Affordable Care Act was passed at, midnight a few days after Christmas and just before New Year's? The new Congress coming in ought to have had 15 days to undo it. After that, no. It becomes the law, that sort of thing. We need to find a way, as another thing, to stop some gerrymandering congressional districts. If you've ever looked at some of the maps of some of our congressional districts, they're incredible. And yet they're only designed for one thing, and that's to keep the party or the person, give them the ability to be reelected. Those are the kinds of things that I think we can do to not completely replace career politicians, but if we could just get a much bigger majority of people who are up there for one term, who are not interested necessarily in reelection, and who are willing to be more statesman or stateswoman-like, then I think our country would be marvelously ahead of where it is now. End of that book.
Isn't the okay? Excellent, and I've actually been following along fairly well with your slides. One question, an observation about the statesman type of representation. I believe, from my reading of the biographies and the autobiographies, and to some extent the Federalist Papers, that was the original intent of the founders, and that is the way that it started out with business owners or industry captains of industry or whatnot going to Washington for a few years to essentially serve the country, much like the military does. And when you sign up for the military, you sign up for X number of years, you serve your time, and then you leave, and the military helps you out after you've left. And it just seems to me that this is sort of the same thing. I don't understand how we got away from it.
If you look at the 55, 60 or so, they weren't always the same people in every instance back in the 1776 to 1787 era and that sort of thing. But if you look at them, they were a mix of military people, George Washington,
yep.
Preachers, politicians, there were some governors, they were business people, they were landowners. Thomas Jefferson was a huge landowner, and he was also very interested in the government of his state of Virginia. there was a total. There were judges, there were lawyers, granted, although I think lawyers in those days weren't quite what lawyers are today. In most cases, they were self-educated, or they were educated at the foot of someone who had been self-educated in the law at the time. But they were themselves a huge mix of different careers, different vocations, and that sort of thing.
Different life disciplines.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. George Washington, for example, was a military man. He was also a businessman and a farmer. He was a surveyor. He was an explorer. He'd been in the French and Indian Wars prior to the time that he got so involved in the American Revolution and the Constitutional Convention and that sort of thing. But he had all kinds of interests and applications.
Okay, let's get. I've got the slideshow for your book about taxes, which is called "Rendering unto Caesar the Fairest Tax." If I recall correctly, I don't have the book right here in front of me, and the title slide is "Help Us Start a Tax Reformation." Yes. Oh God, please, yes, somebody do it.
Well, actually, this is what got me started, because I spent 28 years with a very large firm. A good 20 plus of those years, my job was pricing the services of that firm, defending them in. I worked for the telephone company, so when we had rate cases, I had to make the proposals as to, Mr. Commissioner, if you'll give us some more money next year, here are the changes we'll make to different prices, and I had to just come up with them, and then I had to defend them and that sort of thing for a good 20 years. Pricing, to me, is terribly important if you've got a product and a service, and the government's got a product and a service. I don't think they look at it that way too much, but in fact, we need a pricing plan, which is all in the world a tax plan is. We need a pricing plan that we can understand, that we can relate to what we get for our dollars. We ought to be able to feel like we get a good bang for the buck that we spend in terms of tax dollars. It ought to be a plan that's got some decent economics in it. Hopefully we would be able to pay mostly out of discretionary income, but sometimes there are a lot of people in our country who have little or no discretionary income. We ought to be able to have a plan that gets all of us who sometimes cause the government to be a costly operation. If I live in a place, then I'm one of the main reasons that the government in this particular place spends some of the money it does, whether it's on the police force, the fire department, the street department, or what have you. But if I'm a tourist in a place, I also cause some costs sometimes, and so I ought to be able to help out in that regard. If I'm an illegal alien or a drug dealer, it ought to be a plan that, even though we're not countenancing what these people are doing, they at least contribute revenue toward the government that oversees what they do or doesn't oversee what they do, whatever the case may be. It ought to be a plan that at least encourages me to do the right things. A right thing to me is that as as a citizen, I have needed for years and still need to put a roof over my family's head, to put food on my family's table, to make sure my family's got health insurance, one way or the other, to make sure that my family has set aside something for retirement, and things of that nature. Let me give you an example of our present plan. I get a very nice deduction under our present income tax plan for the mortgage that I've had for years. I get a deduction on the interest I pay. That encourages me to put a roof over my family's head. But you know, if I did not have the resources or the income, and I was forced to be a renter, guess what? I don't get any breaks like that I'm aware of, particularly under our current tax plan. Actually, in my mind, we do not have a tax plan today. We have a quagmire where politicians have reached out over the years. Every time they needed a little bit more money, they've instituted a new tax. They've added a sales tax here and there, or they've added 2 or 3 more percent to that sales tax when they needed some more money. They added an income tax in 1913, and it has just grown unbelievably since that point in time, and in the 100 years since then. When we pass away, we don't get to pass on what we built, if we built anything, to as we would choose. The government first steps in and takes a rather large chunk, and actually the governments, because usually the feds step in first, and then the states are in there right behind them, and then what's left over we get to give as we see fit, either to our heirs, to a favorite charity, to a favorite school, or to in whatever fashion we think it ought to be. So we need a tax plan that is straightforward, easy to understand. In fact, if you notice one of my slides, I've jokingly, everybody knows the KISS rule, and most people think it means one thing. I interpret it this way: keep it simple and straightforward. And we can have a tax plan that meets most of the criteria that I mentioned before. Actually would probably get us a lot more money than the current plans do. For example, we can have a tax plan that is not nearly so easy for an underground economy to develop and flourish. How many people do we know in our own lives that we strongly suspect are not reporting all their income, and that sort of thing? If we had a plan where reporting your income wasn't necessary, then we'd probably draw more of them and their money into the revenue streams that the government would, the sort of thing that I'm thinking of in that regard. The plan I have put forth is based at 20-some-odd years of experience. And I started out with the basic concept that a sales tax does just that. And it does. If you know about the fair tax, it does a very good job of doing just the kinds of things that I mentioned a minute ago for the most part. But it only does that in the middle of the income spectrum. For people with very low incomes, the fair tax eats up income that is not discretionary to them. Now, I know it makes some adjustments to try to help them and that sort of thing, but I think there's much better ways to do it. So you need something at the low end of the scale, but you also need something at the very wealthy end of the scale, or for the very large businesses, because they get to the point where just a pure sales tax, ultimately they can't spend enough money or shop enough days out of the year to pay proportionately what you and I in the middle income would pay as a percentage of our resources. So I have a simple plan. It has three components to it. Most of us would never deal with but two of those. And on one of those, the one that affects mostly the low end, we end up not paying because the taxes are offset by credits we get for just doing the things we need to do, putting a roof over our family's head, putting food on our family's table. We get credits for those, and we'd end up paying almost nothing. The real money to the government comes from the middle part, which is the national sales tax. And then finally, if your name is Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or something like that, or if your business is extremely large, you would get some additional taxes that I call a high revenue tax. But you would get those taxes with options that allow you to reduce them by doing things like hiring more citizen employees in your business, using more domestic materials in what you put together or sell or in any way handle in your business, or by giving to charities, including education and churches. If you do those things, then you can reduce those high revenue taxes even if you're in the very high income range. I think in today's world we talk mostly about individuals or families, above $250,000 a year in income. For a business, we might be talking about a business with more than $10 million in revenues or something like that before it kicks in, that sort of thing. One of the things I do need to mention real quickly is that the first reaction people get to a higher sales tax is, oh my goodness, I don't want to pay more for the things I buy at the store. Well, the answer is you won't. You won't pay more. In fact, in my opinion, you'll pay the same or probably less before the tax plan's been in effect very long. And the reason for that is when you go into a store, and we used to have a toy store. My wife and I used to have a toy store in Atlanta. And if you came into that toy store and bought from us a $10 teddy bear, we charged you $10, and we added on to that 7%, which was the going sales tax in our state at that time. So you paid $10.70 for a $10 teddy bear. Under my tax plan, the business that made that first of all, I took my business several years later after the accountants had done their thing, and I went back to the accounting figures on our couple of years there, and I took out all the taxes that we had paid as a business. And I found that I could have sold you that teddy bear for $8 if I had not needed to pay so many taxes like unemployment taxes to the feds, unemployment taxes to the state, matching Social Security taxes, and on and on and on, income taxes on the profits we made, that sort of thing. I could have sold you that teddy bear for $8. What's more, the guy that sold me the teddy bear before I sold it to you, he could have, instead of selling it for $5 or $5.50, which is what I had to pay for it, he probably could have sold it for a lot less himself. The guy who manufactured that teddy bear could have sold it to him for less. And right on back down the chain, all the way down to the people who dug the materials out of the ground before they or picked the cotton before they actually put that teddy bear together. We could have sold you that teddy bear for somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 or $6. and made the same kind of profits or losses that we made selling you that teddy bear under today's plan at $10. If I could sell you that teddy bear for, say, $6, we could have had a 75% sales tax rate. And people choke when they hear that. But you know what the total price you would have paid for that teddy bear was? $6 plus 75% in sales tax would have been $10.50. That's actually less than the $10.70 that you paid back in those years when you bought that teddy bear from us. So there is a great deal we can do to come up with a simple tax system that people can understand, people can relate to. It can encourage them and our businesses to do the right things being put a roof over our family's head, businesses hire more citizens, businesses make more, do more made in the USA type stuff, and for all of us, give more to charity, give more to churches, give more to schools that we think are doing a good job, that sort of thing. I think it is a tax plan that we can work. I wish we could. I do not personally think that any of our existing politicians, or certainly not many of them, would be interested in, because it puts more options in our hands, the taxpayer, and yet it gets money to the government much faster. Many sales taxes go in from larger businesses every day. We wouldn't even need withholding taxes on our paychecks. Instead of looking at the number at the bottom of our check stub, we'd be looking at bringing home the number that's at the top of our pay stub. That's what we made. That's what we earned. That's what we worked for. And yet we accept going home with a number down at the bottom that's much lower. So that is the new tax plan in a nutshell. It would be easy to convert to it. We could do it very quickly in a matter of just a few years. Businesses would quickly adjust their prices, and I think we as consumers would really move ahead very fast.
I think so. On your PowerPoint slideshow, on slide 6, you have a very handy graph entitled Taxes Paid by Individuals. And I think that is an excellent visual representation of what you're talking about. So do you have that handy in front of you that you could explain it to us?
Yeah, is it slide 6 or chart 6? I'm with you.
I'm not sure.
Chart 6.
Yeah, chart 6. I'm sorry. I go by, I say slides, you say charts.
That chart illustrates the 3 components that I talked about. The first component is what I call the national dues and the credits. And if you look at that chart, there is a series of lines that start down below 0, but as your income goes up to 25, 50, 75,000 or whatever, it comes up and then it just levels out at about $3,000 or something like that. That would be what we would pay for that tax component, dues and credits. The very poorest of us, by doing volunteer work, could actually get, in the book I call it a refund. Technically it's not a refund if you didn't pay anything to start with, but that kind of puts the idea across. If you then look at that chart, the second component is the national sales tax, and all of us, including our businesses, pay a sales tax when we buy goods and services, unless those goods and services are very basic things, meat and potatoes at the supermarket. They would not be taxable. Vegetables in the vegetable bins would not be taxable. Bread would not be taxable. Frozen foods, prepared dinners, ice cream, all the things that aren't basic would be taxable. If I'm building a house, lumber would not be taxable. If I am buying clothes, a man's suit would not be taxable. A man's tuxedo would be taxable. So that's the sales tax item. Everybody and businesses of all types would pay sales taxes. That is the line then, and it's got a bunch of dashes on it, but it starts at zero because if you've got zero income, you're not buying very much. And as your income goes up and you become more and more of a shopper, that line goes up, and then somewhere around $20,000, it begins to level out. I don't know exactly if that's where it would level out, but somewhere in that neighborhood, you and I, if we had enough income, would get to the point where we could not shop 24/7 and still spend enough to keep that line just going up and up and up. The other thing we do as we get up into those higher incomes is we start spending our money differently. Instead of buying things, we start investing in savings accounts, in bonds, in stocks, in businesses that we want to start ourselves and that sort of thing. So that is the second line. That is the sales tax. Finally, there is a third component which only the very wealthiest people and the very largest corporations would pay. But I started that chart at $100,000. In today's world, we'd probably start that line at $250,000. I actually wrote this book and this plan back in the early 90s, and back then $100,000 was considered pretty high income. Today we'd say that's probably $250,000. But at $250,000, an individual would begin to pay, say, 1%. And then maybe at $275,000, that would move up to 2%, and then 3%, and then 4%, and ultimately just on up and up and up. Same thing for businesses, although businesses would probably start at a higher level. Now, if I take those three dotted lines, dashed lines, and let's just take a point like $100,000. If I add the revenue, the taxes that I'm paying from the first component to the second component, I get what's on that blue line, that dark box. That's how much taxes I paid in total. If I am lucky enough to earn $200,000 that year, then I have to add 3 lines into it, and I get the blue line is much, much higher. But if you look at the blue line, that's the total of all the taxes you and I would pay at any given level of income. And if you look at it, we're all paying about the same percentages. And to me, that's probably the closest you can come to a definition. We talk about fair, whatever that means, so often. F-A-I-R, fair. That is probably as close to coming to what we would call a fair tax plan, if we all pay approximately the same level given our income. And then we do give a little bit of break to the guy or the lady who has little or no income, because if they have little or no income, they have no discretionary income, which is what we all want to live off of. Discretionary income is what's left over after we've paid for the things we have to pay for. That sort of thing. But that's an example of how that chart would work.
That is...
Bill, I want to say one other thing,
Go ahead.
We could work this tax plan in such a way that not only the federal tax is paid, but if the states participate, the state tax is paid at the same time. Not only that, but the city tax would be paid. The county tax would be paid. You and I would end up at the end of the year having paid all of our taxes, and if our state and city and county met its goals during the year and had anything left over out of that, we'd get a refund next April 15th. And the government's getting its money so quickly that we don't have to have a withholding plan and that sort of thing.
So we could do away
Did that
with a
kind
lot of the tax system.
Walk you through the chart?
Yes, it did. For me, that was very illustrative of how your plan works. And I was looking over your website and everything. I saw that chart, and I said, now this is something that people can understand. That people always like a little visual aid to explain something, and I think that explains it pretty well. And you can see that at affirm1776.org, where you can also, I believe, purchase the books. Is that correct?
I don't believe that so, but if you get on affirm1776.org and get in touch with me, I'll make sure I'll get you a way to purchase the book.
Okay, very good.
If you want to purchase it from me, I'll get you a signed copy. If not, you can do it through the publisher, or you can do it through Amazon or Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, that type of thing.
Okay. Shall we continue with the explaining the tax plan?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay.
There are a lot of little wrinkles that you get into. The old saying, the devil is in the details, and that sort of thing, and they are. And so the book is kind of divided into 3 sections, and the last section gets into a lot of those kind of details and that sort of thing. But what I'd like to do is just mention a few things that I think are pretty important. Number one, this plan could easily work for the federal, the state, and the local taxes. You and I would pay almost the same thing in all 3 cases if that was the way it was done. I would pay the federal component or part of it, and that would be identical to what you pay up there in Michigan, or somebody in Wyoming, or somebody in California or New York would pay for the federal. We all would pay the same federal thing. When it gets to the state part, I would pay the Georgia component. You would pay the Michigan. If Georgia and Michigan operated perfectly identically and everything, we'd pay the same thing. But they're not going to operate that way. So you might pay a little more or a little less depending upon how Michigan is governed, and than I would depending upon how Georgia is governed. When I get down here to Georgia, everybody else in Georgia would pay the same thing for the Georgia component that I pay. When I get to the local component, I live about 100 miles northeast of Atlanta. So I would pay a local component that is a little different from, say, somebody in Atlanta or somebody in Macon or somebody in Savannah. You would pay a little bit different for your local component where you live from somebody in, say, Pontiac or Lansing or something of that nature. How do we figure those parts? We figure them very simply. The federal government would have to put together a budget for the coming year, and they have to do it by September 1, or it gets set for them at 95% of last year's budget. Or actually, they're doing it last year, so it gets set at 95% of the current year's budget. Same thing for Georgia, same thing for Michigan, same thing for my local area, same thing for your local area. So let's just pick out one of them and kind of walk through it a little bit. Let's pick out the federal piece. The federal comes up with a budget of X trillion dollars. We've got 310, 315 million citizens. We can divide that X trillion dollars by 315, and that's your federal component, and it's the identical piece to my federal component down here in Georgia. Okay? Now, we will treat, again, we're getting devil is in the details, we will treat youngsters a little differently. If we divide the federal government by 300 and, let's say, 10 million people, and it comes out to be $3,000 per person, that's how much I owe in dues for getting the distinct privilege of belonging to this country club called the United States of America. My child, I don't have one now at this age, but back when I did, any child from 2 to 18 would get half of that. My wife would get the same $3,000. I get $3,000. If I had a child that was, say, 15 years old, it'd be $1,500. If we had a baby that year, up to 2 years of age, it'd be $0. Okay, now we've got a dues component for you and me to pay for our federal government, and now we start looking at the credits for paying for a house, putting a roof over our family's head, putting health insurance down on my family, making sure we're covered in health insurance, making sure we got a retirement plan, making sure we got clothes on our back, making sure we got food on our table. And we start getting credits which reduce those to the point that if I work at it halfway hard, actually not very hard at all, I will end up reducing that component to $0, and I won't owe any taxes on that particular component for the year, and you probably won't either. We do the same thing for the state component, except in Georgia, we'll take the state budget, which of course is much smaller, or in Michigan you take the state budget, which again would be much smaller than the federal, and divide it by the population of citizens, and you come up with the Michigan component, or the Georgia dues. Same thing for the local. That's how we would come about with that component, and then we basically have the opportunity to wipe it all out by taking credit for doing the things we do, including volunteers' work. Okay? So if we could even get a little extra credit for volunteer work, for our investments, for our retirement plans, for all of those kinds of things. Not only would we pay our state and local and federal at the same time, but the governments would actually get their money much faster than even through the withholding systems under the plan I have here. Several other things I think we could mention that would be somewhat useful. The plan forces governments to set a budget, something they haven't been very good, not all of them have been very good at doing, or have it set for them, and then they have to live within it. If they can set a budget and produce taxes, and most of them will under this plan, before the year is over, which exceed that budget, then any extra over and above will go toward, half of it would go toward reducing any debt they're carrying. Let's say it's a city and they're carrying some debt on a football stadium or something like that. It would reduce debt they're carrying. The other half would then go toward a refund for its citizens in the coming year. If the city, let's use a case of a city, if the city could set a budget, let's say I live in a small town. Actually, I live in the county, so I'll use the county as an example. Let's say the county sets a budget of $20 million. And as they go through the year, the taxes come in at $25 million. The $5 million difference, half of that would go to pay the debt, pay off debt early. The other half would go to a refund, which I would share with the other citizens who live in my county. If the city had a budget of $20 million, but actually managed through some good management to come in at $18 million, that's $2 million that they earned, and all of us citizens would get an immediate refund on our share of that $2 million next April 15th. So there are a lot of little details and things in the plan, and yet the beauty of it to me is it stays very simple. I only have to look at what I spend in order, and I can just keep up with my receipts or my credit card statements or my checkbook statements in order to figure out how much credits I get. On the sales tax piece, I either buy the thing now or I wait until next month when I've got a little bit more money in my pocket and buy it then. But I'm paying my sales tax as I go along when I choose. The government doesn't, of course, with the NSA, it probably doesn't matter anymore, but technically the government doesn't need to know how much I paid, who I am, how many children I've got, what size my house is, or any of those kind of personal data things that go along with all the tax plans we have today. And finally, only if I'm really fortunate and in the real high wealth area would I probably be subject to the third part and some extra government scrutiny, but certainly not as much or not more than I'm already subject to today. We can convert to this thing very quickly over, say, a 3-year, 4-year span, be pretty painless. The transition plan is very, very easy to understand and follow and implement. Have I explained it?
Yes, you have. I have your transition plan right up here on the screen. This will, of course, be on the YouTube version of the show as well as the live video stream that we have going on right now. While you were talking about the various components, I was showing the relevant sections of the book on the screen so that people can actually see what the book looks like. So hopefully that will generate some interest in the plan. Let's finish up the show with one topic that has intrigued me a lot that I hope you can touch on right here at the end. And that would be, how do we get all of this in place? What can we do? Say I get up tomorrow morning, me, Bill Xam, and I'm sitting in the kitchen drinking some tea because I'm not allowed to drink caffeine anymore, so I'm having a little bit of herbal tea. And I'm sitting there minding my own business, and I think to myself, I should probably get started on this project of replacing these clowns in Washington, D.C. with Mr. Savage's plan. How can we start doing that?
Well, let me tell you how I think we cannot do it. All of the amendments to the Constitution that have been done so far have been done using the process in Article 5 of our Constitution, which is the first process, which is to do it through Congress. I don't think we can possibly do it through the Congress and the officials we have now, whether we're going to replace the tax plan or whether we're going to put in some term limits or whether we're going to put in some automatic sunsets or on requirements on laws or not. So we're going to have to do it through the second process. And I was intrigued, a little upset. A very well-known author just recently released a book just ahead of mine. And he's got a lot more following than I have, but he and I are in perfect agreement. We're going to have to do it the second way that Congress gave us, and that is the people are going to have to do it through state conventions and that sort of thing. So to me, what we have got to do is go through town hall processes, discussions, meetings. We actually need to run a convention and not allow the existing politicians and bureaucrats into it. And
That's
people
what I
are
was
going to say,
wondering.
well, that's crazy. You can't do that. But guess what? In our own Constitution, our founders made sure that the existing politicians in Washington could not participate in the Electoral College. So there's plenty of precedent for doing what I'm saying there. I have an addendum in Shortening Our Leash on Politicians, the second book, where I go through a very simplistic description of just how we would have to do it. We'd have to get 34 states to call on Congress for a convention. If I understand the Constitution, Congress would have no option but to establish a Constitution for us to consider amendments to the Constitution. Once we have that convention, anything that comes out of it, say 1 amendment, 10 amendments, 10 things in 1 amendment, whatever, we would then have to go and get within, say, 5 years, 7 years, whatever is established. Normally, I think it's around 7 years. We would have to get 38 states, the people in 38 states, to ratify. And it could be done. We're not going to get it done the first way under Article 5. I am convinced.
I believe you're
I
correct.
think my phone's about to die on us here. But we could do it through the second way, and I do have an addendum that walks us through a very simplistic approach. But I think it would serve to kind of describe what we would have to do. We're going to have to do it as the people, not as our government officials. But remember, in 1776, that's exactly what the founders were faced with. They had to do it, and they had a short window to do it in, and they did it. Now, they had the advantage. They had a big ocean between them and the king and the parliament, but that we don't have. But that's exactly the same situation they were in, I think.
I believe you are correct. And we are coming up to under 3 minutes left for the show, so we will be wrapping up the show in just another minute or so. Is there anything that you would like to add to any of the points that we discussed tonight?
I would love for a firm to be one of the instruments that helps get us there. And so the website that you've mentioned, my job at this point in time is to make a firm something that it has not been up until now. It's been a very static
90
instrument
seconds.
website. I've got to get myself and maybe some help from other people in getting a firm, getting the blog going better, in getting the Speakers Bureau and town halls and that sort of thing going stronger. And that's going to take a lot of help, a lot of people. And I would invite people to talk to me via a firm or whatever.